Hello, everybody. It's Gina again. Okay, so video number 2. Today, this video, I'm going to describe. I'm going to describe the vocabulary words. I'm going to probably. My goal is to hit the vocabulary words. Like I'm going to talk about the word gene just a little bit. I'm going to talk about the word heterozygous, homozygous. I'm going to talk about the word dominant and recessive, and I'm going to talk about the word genotype and phenotype. Those are really important when you are answering genetics questions. So, for example, I might say in a cross of, I like to use hamsters, in a cross of a hamster that has fluffy fur, let's say in a cross of a hamster that's homozygous dominant for fluffy fur, across it with a hamster that is heterozygous, what are the genotypes and phenotypes of the predicted offspring, right? You just need to know the vocabulary. If you know what the words mean that I just said, then you can get through to it. But if you don't ever decide that you need to memorize or study that vocabulary, you will never be able to answer these types of genetics questions. The words are really not, they sound hard: heterozygous, homozygous, genotype, phenotype. Like it doesn't, those words are not normal to anyone's language if you don't say them on a daily basis. So it is your job, specifically your job, to know what those words mean. You'll never get through this if you don't. So here we go. We're going to get you through those words. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Share my screen, and I'm going to describe what some of these words mean. So we're going to do vocabulary. Oops, wrong way. Okay, this is a review. We've done this already one other time, or maybe 2 other times, I'm not sure. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands the idea of gene, what a gene actually is, like literally what a gene is. So I like this analogy that I created. I stole all these images from the internet. So imagine, right, you are, I mean, let's not imagine, let's just say you are human, and in any one of your somatic cells, you have 46 chromosomes. 23 of them came from the sperm, and 23 of them came from the egg. For any pair, right, you have a pair of number 1s, you have a pair of number 2s, you have a pair of number 3s. I have said that in PowerPoints and in handouts. The textbook have said that for like the last 2 chapters. So this should be review. For any given pair, all right, you have inherited a version from the sperm and a version from the egg. Okay, and that hit at fertilization, and it became basically you, right? That one cell became 2, 2 became 4, and then ultimately became you as a human being. So I just want to describe a chromosome right now. So this stack of books, right? I just picked one of the 46 that you get, right? I just picked any random one. This is a chromosome for any one of the 46 that you have. And each chromosome is sort of the equivalent of a stack of books. And the amount or the number of books in any stack for a chromosome, the number of genes for any chromosome is variable, right? So chromosome number 1, you have 2 of those, one from the egg, one from the sperm. Chromosome number 1 has about 2,000 genes. So think about each one of these books as a gene. And in this image here, if you were to count down, I don't know, let's say where the arrow is for that gene. Let's say that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the 8th book down. That is the location of the gene, let's say, for whether or not you can roll your tongue like a taco, right? Some of you can't do that. Most of you can, but I would say 1 in 12 of you cannot do it. It's pretty common. There's a gene for being able to roll your tongue, right? And it exists on your chromosome at the same exact location, whether you got that gene from the egg or the sperm. It's in the same exact location. It's called the locus or loci. It's a gene address. Where does the gene exist on the chromosome, and which chromosome is it? So for example, this one, we're making this up, but let's say this is chromosome number 1, and it's located on, chromosomes have a short arm at the top and a long arm at the bottom. So we'll see that in a second. So this would be located like on the Q arm at number 8, because it's the 8th book down. And all for all humans, that gene is located in the same spot. Okay, so it's the gene address, right? You can give anybody in the world your home address and they'd be able to find it because it's the same spot, right? Same thing for genes. So the gene is, and so on chromosome number 1, let's say you have 2,000 genes. If you went all the way down to, let's say, chromosome number 20, you'd have a lot less, right? So maybe 500, so much less. All a gene is DNA. That's all it is, right? There's some protein involved. We're not even going to worry about it. All a gene is a big, long stretch of DNA. And while we haven't gotten there yet, it's coming up. The next chapter and the chapter after that, that DNA says to your cell, make this protein. That's all your DNA does. It's like a little book of information, like a constitution that says, you go make this protein. Just like our constitution gives us our laws, right? And the rules and all that good stuff. Your DNA says, go make this protein. So this gene, if we're calling it the tongue rolling gene, this gene has information in the form of DNA, A, T, C's, and G's, that says, go make this protein, that gets put underneath your tongue in utero, like while you're still inside the uterus, right? Put this protein under your tongue so that you can roll it like a taco. Some people, they still get the DNA, but the DNA doesn't make an actual protein. It's just recessive. It just doesn't make the protein. The DNA, the code is different, and you don't make the protein. So the only time you can make this protein that goes under your tongue is if you inherit the right directions that give your cells the actual A, T, C's, and G's on how to make the protein that goes under your tongue, right? If you don't get that information, if you don't get the dominant allele, if you don't get the dominant information, you're not making this little thing that goes under your tongue. Very simple example, but it's a good one. So a gene is a stretch of DNA that codes for a specific protein. Okay. The gene that you get, right? So the gene we're talking about here is tongue rolling. The form of the gene that you get is called an allele, allele, right? So there, in this case, there's 2 forms to the allele. You get the protein that allows you to roll your tongue, or you don't, right? You don't, it's not always that you only have 2 alleles. You can have 50 alleles. You can have 50 versions. That's why we all look so different, right? But in this case, there's just 2 of them, which is kind of nice. It makes it easy. All right, let's talk about some vocabulary. All right, so this is very common to genetics, these 2 vocabulary words, dominant and recessive. So when you inherit the dominant form, I always have to tell you, right? You always have to be given that information. You could kind of figure it out, but I wouldn't do that to you. But the dominant trait, I have to tell you which one. Like if I'm talking about hamsters, is I'll say fluffy hair is dominant to smooth hair, right? I'll give you that piece of information. You have to search for it. I have to give it to you. I don't try to make it a mystery. So if you inherit the dominant allele, you're going to express the dominant trait, right? If it's there, if the directions are there in Mendelian genetics, you're going to express that trait. Okay. The way we write a dominant allele is with a capital letter. So the dominant allele, if you inherit the dominant allele for tongue rolling, we're going to denote it as a capital T, right? And since you have since there's a sperm and egg that made you, you have to have 2 alleles. So maybe you inherited 2 big T's, one in the egg and one in the sperm, or maybe you inherited a big T in the sperm and a little t in the egg, right? And then you'd be big T, little t. Okay, so that's how we're going to denote dominance, with a capital letter. And then the recessive allele, the recessive trait, is only expressed if you've inherited both recessive alleles in the egg and the sperm. Because like I just said, like in the last video, I wrote it on the top of the screen. I said, if the dominant allele is present, the dominant trait is going to be expressed. So the only way to express that recessive trait, like inability to roll your tongue or non-tongue roller, is if you don't get any dominant alleles. Because once you get the dominant allele, you're going to be that dominant trait. So in this case, if you get a big T, you're going to be able to roll your tongue. So the only way you can be a non-tongue roller is if you do not inherit a dominant allele. You have to be little t, little t. Okay. Recessives are shown with a lowercase letter. You can inherit a dominant and a recessive, right? You can inherit a recessive and a recessive. And just a note of advice, when you're writing these letters out, be really careful with how you write them, because like if for some reason I'm to blame for this sometimes. If I give you P as a letter, capital P and a lowercase p, depending on how you write it, can look very similar. So just be careful, right? T's are good because a capital T and a lowercase t look very different. So just be careful how you write them. You know, like an N, that's just a terrible letter to give somebody when you're doing genetics, but I seem to do it all the time. So just be careful. All right, let's keep going. All right, here's just an example of a gene and its loci. So the gene loci is where it lives, or its gene address. And so in this example, you have, this is the loci, and the gene here is for color, eye color, and this individual expressed the trait as brown. Okay, and here's another example. This loci is down here in the long arm of the chromosome. The gene is for hair color. My printer's going off and I don't know what's happening over there. Sorry if it's loud. And this person expressed the trait as hazel hair. I don't really know what hazel hair is. But here's another example of the same thing. This individual, this is showing an individual, a diploid individual, so like body cells, and it's showing 3 loci. So 3 different genes. One is for hair color, one is for height, and one is for lipoma formation, whether you get like these little lipid balls that exist. And so you can either, in this case, you see there's 2 different alleles. For hair color, you can either have red or brown. There's probably many alleles, but in this case, we're just saying 2. And for height, this person inherited both the same allele, tall and tall. So they inherited both. You know that there's more alleles involved, right? You can get a short allele. And then in this case, this person inherited 2 different alleles for lipoma formation. They got no lipomas from one parent in the egg, and they got lipomas in the sperm. So you can tell, I can tell you, I wouldn't ask you this, but I can tell from that lipoma formation, that having lipomas is dominant. I can tell just from looking at that. So that's just another example of 3 genes at 3 different loci on a pair of homologous chromosomes. Right, so that's how you read that. Okay. Here's just another example of the same exact thing. Okay, it's just I just drew this out for you. So we can see here there's 5 loci, so 5 different genes, right? And there's one for earwax, eye color. If you make the enzyme that dissolves the webbing between your toes or your feet, tongue rolling, and the gene for dimples. Okay, so there's 5 different genes, and you can see here that this individual has inherited pretty much the same gene from each, the sperm and the egg, for all of these except for the eye color one. The eye color one, you can see here, the eye color one has 2 different ones, 2 different alleles. It inherited a blue one and a brown one. Since brown is dominant, this individual will have brown eyes, but you can tell, but here they're the same, they're red, here they're green, here they're orange, and here they're yellow. So they're all the same. They inherited the same allele, which is pretty common, right? It's pretty common for all of those genes. All right, so we'll keep going. Okay, so 2 more vocabulary words. So we've already covered, oops, computer, go forward. Oopsie. We'll go back to genotype and phenotype in a second. Let's talk about these 2 vocabulary words. So we have homozygous and heterozygous, very important vocabulary words in genetics, and I'll use those words in examples and problems. When you inherit in the sperm and the egg, right, you have a set of homologous chromosomes. You have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes, but in any set of homologous chromosomes, you are going to inherit a version from the egg and a version from the sperm. If the version of the gene that you inherit is the same, in the egg and the sperm for that specific gene, that is said to be homozygous. The prefix homo means same. Okay, so if you inherit two of the same versions of an allele for any given trait, it's said to be homozygous. If you inherit two different alleles, the egg gave you one version and the sperm gave you another, then that is said to be heterozygous when you inherit two different alleles. Okay, so let's go to this image. So here we can see these are a set of homologous chromosomes that were inherited in the at conception. And you can see here in this, let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. You can see here that in this example, for this loci here, this individual is homozygous because they inherited a big P and a big P. Right? So they are homozygous for the dominant allele. So we would call this homozygous dominant. Okay. Then if you look at the second loci, this one here, you can see that this the person who inherited both these chromosomes in the sperm and from the sperm and the egg, they are homozygous recessive. So still homozygous because both of them are the same letter, little a, little a. But in this case, since they're small lowercase letters, we know it's the recessive one. So this person would express the recessive trait. And then last but not least, the third loci, big B, little b, this person is considered heterozygous. They have one of each, right? Hetero means different. So they have inherited a dominant allele and a recessive allele. So they are, if this is considered, if we're looking at something that's just straight up Mendelian genetics, that person will express whatever that big B is representing, right? Because once the dominant allele is present, then the dominant trait will be expressed. If this is non-Mendelian, then that's a different story. We haven't covered that yet. Okay, so that's how you use those two vocabulary words of homozygous versus heterozygous. So let's go back. I'm going to go back to this slide here. So if you look at this slide, you can see that 4 of these genes are homozygous, just based on color, right? I didn't use any letters, but just based on color, 4 of these are homozygous and 1 of them is heterozygous, right? So for example, let's say this first one up here at the top, gene for earwax, let's say this is big A, right? So that makes it homozygous. That both colors are red. If you can't see the colors, I apologize. I know that's not fair. But the second one, they're different. So this one, for example, would be when you inherit a blue eye color, that's recessive, and this would be big B, right? So that's heterozygous. This is the only one that's heterozygous. Okay, and then the green one, let's say this is big G, big G. This orange one, let's say it's little o, homozygous recessive there. The green one was homozygous dominant. And then the yellow one, let's call it little y, right? They're the same. And so that's homozygous recessive too. So that's how you use those two vocabulary words. And if we, oh, genotype, phenotype. Okay. And then last but not least, for vocabulary, I believe, we have these 2 words, genotype and phenotype. So genotype is your physical expression of a trait. So for example, if you have dimples is dominant. Actually, I have a big one over here on this side. I think it is. Yeah. If you have dimples, that's a phenotype. If you have brown hair, that's a phenotype. If you have blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes or hazel eyes, those are all phenotypes, a physical expression of a trait. If you are tall, right? If you produce insulin, right? That's a phenotype. If you're an insulin producer, if you're not an insulin producer, those are all phenotypes, a physical expression of a trait. If you have a really long second toe, that is a phenotype. Both my kids have really long second toes. It's kind of funny. All physical expressions of the trait, right? I often just think about it as the stuff you can see, but you have to remember there's stuff inside your body too, right? All the proteins that you're making. So that's also phenotypes. Genotype is the genetic combination of alleles you have inherited, right? So it's the genetic makeup of the individual. Like, are you big D, big D? Are you big B, big B? Are you big B, little b? Are you little s, right? What allele combination did you inherit, right? They're connected, right? Genotype and phenotype are connected. If I know that for Dimples, I'm big D, then I know my genotype is big D, and my phenotype is dimpled, right? Because dimples are dominant. Let's say for tongue rolling, my genotype, if my genotype were little t, then that would be my genotype, and I would know that I was a non-tongue roller, which is not true. I can roll my tongue. So your genotype is the allelic combination you have inherited from the sperm and the egg, like big T, and your phenotype is the physical expression of that trait, and that would be like tongue rolling. Okay, so that is the difference between these two vocabulary words. We got homozygous, heterozygous. So the question here is, what would be the genotype of an individual that is homozygous dominant for Dimples, right? So Dimples is dominant. We're going to use the letter D. And the second one says, what would be the phenotype for an individual with the genotype big D, little d, right? So hit pause if you're not sure, because I'm going to write the answers in a second. But you should make sure you can answer both of these before you go on. If you can't, then you have to watch this video again. Your job, right? You can do it. I know you can. All right, here we go. So what would be the genotype of an individual? So how am I going to deconstruct this question? So genotype. All right, I know what genotype means. Do you know what genotype means? That is important. So I know that genotype means alleles, right? That means the genetics. So I know that I'm talking about letters here, right? I have to figure out what the letters are. Okay, so genotype, that's what that means, of an individual that is, oh, here's another vocabulary word, homozygous. Okay, we know that homo means same. So the letters have to be the same, right? Of course they're going to be the same. Like we're always going to use, if we're talking about tongue rolling, we're going to use the letter T. If we're talking about earwax, we're going to use an E. But when I say same, I mean, are they both dominant or are they both recessive? So I need a little bit more information here, right? I can't just leave you hanging with an individual that is homozygous, right? I guess I could actually, I could make it a little more challenging, but I generally don't. Because it says the next word here says dominant, right? So that is important. So that makes me realize that they're both going to be uppercase, right? They're going to be uppercase dominant letters. So homozygous means same, dominant means, well, the way we denote it is with the uppercase. So that tells me that this is going to be big D. Genotype for homozygous dominant, big D. And then this one down at the bottom, oh, so here's another vocabulary word, phenotype. What the heck does that word mean? All these words. Phenotype means your physical characteristics, like the actual thing, right? The actual physical characteristic. And I know in this question that we're still talking about dimples. So the phenotype for dimples is either, so it's either, so it's the physical characteristic. And here we're talking about either dimples or no dimples. Okay, so big D, little d, what's that going to be? Are they going to have dimples or not going to have dimples? Well, if you have picked up some of the things I've already talked about, then you know that I said and wrote, I said it in this video and I said it in the last video. If that dominant allele is present, the dominant trait will be expressed, right? I'm not going to write that again because I wrote it already and I've said it, but the dominant allele is there. We know that dimples is dominant. So this person will be dimpled. Okay. Fantastic. All right, I think that's it for this. Let me just double check. I think that's it for this video. We did it already. And yeah, and then the next video, I'm going to show you how to do a Punnett square. All right. Cheers. That's it for this one. All right. Be back in a little while. Yeah. Let's see.